47 surgical procedures, 47 human beings subjected to experimental organ transplantation, 0 survivors. These numbers were meticulously documented in a leather-bound journal discovered in 1891, hidden behind a false wall in what had been the surgical theater of Belmont Plantation in Charleston County, South Carolina. The journal detailed something that defied medical understanding of its time: systematic attempts to transplant animal organs into human subjects between 1847 and 1851. What makes this discovery particularly disturbing is not just the experiments themselves, but the clinical precision with which each failure was recorded, the careful notes on suffering duration, and the chilling fact that local authorities had known about these procedures and actively helped conceal them for over 40 years. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Silas Thornwell and the surgical wing that was ordered burned to the ground by the state legislature in 1852, I need you to do something. If this type of dark historical mystery interests you, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. And I'm curious, leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. Now, let's uncover what really happened in that plantation surgical theater and why 47 people never left it alive. The discovery of that journal would never have occurred if not for the Great Charleston Fire of 1891, which consumed 12 city blocks and revealed architectural secrets that families had paid handsomely to keep buried. But to understand the horror documented in those pages, we need to travel back 44 years to a South Carolina that existed in the shadow of profound contradictions. Charleston in 1847 was a city of remarkable contrasts. Its cobblestone streets hosted some of the finest medical minds in the country, graduates of European universities who had returned to establish practices that rivaled those of Boston and Philadelphia. The Medical Society of South Carolina, founded in 1789, had built a reputation for surgical innovation that drew students from across the nation. Yet this same city's economy rested entirely upon the enslavement of human beings, creating a peculiar intersection of scientific advancement and profound moral darkness. Dr. Silas Thornwell arrived in Charleston in early 1846, presenting credentials from the University of Edinburgh and letters of introduction from physicians in London. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and possessed of a singular obsession that he initially kept well hidden. Contemporary accounts describe him as unremarkable in appearance: average height, brown hair beginning to thin, hands that were noted for their steadiness. What set him apart was his intensity. Several Charleston physicians who met him during his first months in the city later recalled that his conversations always circled back to a single topic: the theoretical possibility of replacing diseased human organs with healthy ones. The concept wasn't entirely unknown. European surgeons had experimented with blood transfusions from animals to humans as early as the 1660s, with universally fatal results that had led to the practice being banned. Organ transplantation existed only as wild speculation, the stuff of philosophical debates in medical societies, not serious scientific pursuit. The human body's rejection of foreign tissue wasn't understood. That knowledge lay decades in the future. What Thornwell proposed in those early Charleston conversations seemed less like science and more like the ravings of Gothic literature. But Thornwell had something most experimental surgeons lacked: significant personal wealth inherited from textile manufacturing, and a willingness to use that wealth in ways that would have horrified his Presbyterian minister father back in Connecticut. Within 6 months of his arrival, he had purchased Belmont Plantation, a struggling rice operation 15 miles northwest of Charleston. The plantation came with 42 enslaved people, a main house in disrepair, and several outbuildings that included a former overseer's cottage that Thornwell would transform into something unprecedented. The enslaved community at Belmont had already endured significant hardship under the previous owner, a gambler named Harrison Calhoun, who had drunk himself to death and left the property mortgaged beyond its value. Thornwell's arrival initially seemed like a potential improvement. He announced he had no interest in rice cultivation and would be converting the plantation to what he called a private medical facility. The fieldwork would be minimal, he explained through his newly hired overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Rayburn. Instead, the enslaved people would maintain the grounds, the buildings, and support his medical research. What that research would entail, he did not specify. Thornwell spent the latter months of 1846 renovating the overseer's cottage. He had the building stripped to its frame and rebuilt according to specifications he drew himself. Large windows were installed on the north side to provide optimal light. The interior was divided into 3 rooms, a surgical theater in the center, a recovery room on one side, and on the other, what his construction workers noted with unease, appeared to be a series of large animal pens with drainage channels carved into the floor. Local craftsmen who worked on the project later reported disturbing details. The surgical theater was fitted with iron restraint points embedded in both the ceiling beams and the floor. A large table was constructed from white oak and fitted with leather straps at 6 points. The recovery room contained 8 narrow beds, also equipped with restraints. When one carpenter asked why a medical facility needed so many restraints, Thornwell replied that he would be treating patients who might thrash during fever dreams and injure themselves. The answer was accepted because the alternative, imagining the true purpose, was simply too horrific for decent people to consider. The animal pens puzzled the workers even more. Why would a medical facility need such sturdy enclosures? Thornwell explained he would be studying animal anatomy to better understand human disease. He ordered the construction of a covered walkway connecting the animal housing to the surgical theater, with doors at each end that could be barred from outside. The design allowed for livestock to be moved directly into the surgical space without being seen from the main grounds. By January 1847, construction was complete. Thornwell began acquiring animals, not just chickens or pigs for routine study, but expensive specimens. He purchased 2 young hogs at premium prices, selecting them for their size and health. He acquired 3 sheep from a breeder in Virginia who specialized in large rams. Most notably, he paid an extraordinary sum for a young chimpanzee that had been brought to Charleston by a merchant sailor. The creature's fate would prove particularly significant, though not in ways anyone anticipated. Thornwell's activities might have attracted more scrutiny, except that he cultivated relationships carefully. He donated generously to the Medical Society of South Carolina. He attended church services, though those who sat near him noticed he never sang the hymns, only moved his lips silently. He hosted small dinners for local physicians, during which he spoke eloquently about advancing medical knowledge for the benefit of all humanity. He never mentioned what specific research he was conducting, and the polite society of Charleston didn't press him for details. The enslaved community at Belmont, however, had a much clearer view of what was developing. They watched the construction with growing dread. They heard the animals in their pens, the sounds carrying across the grounds at night. They noticed that Thornwell took his meals alone and often worked through the night, lamplight visible in the surgical theater until dawn. And they noticed something else. Thornwell had begun making notations in a journal he carried everywhere, observing them with an attention that felt less medical and more like a butcher examining livestock. One person saw the danger more clearly than others. Her name was Dinah, and she was 42 years old that winter. She had been born on the plantation and served as the community's healer, treating illnesses with herbs and knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother. Dinah had survived 25 years under Harrison Calhoun's brutal management by being invisible when necessary and indispensable when called upon. She understood white people in a way that came from necessity, reading their moods, their intentions, the subtle signs that preceded violence. What she read in Silas Thornwell terrified her. That man got death in his eyes, she told her daughter Clara one February evening, her voice low as they prepared cornmeal in the cooking house. I seen men who take pleasure in cruelty. I seen men who kill without thinking, but this one different. He looked at us like we already dead, just waiting for him to write it down in that book of his. Clara, 20 years old and pregnant with her first child, squeezed her mother's hand. "We just got to stay clear of him, Mama. Do our work, keep our heads down." "Can't stay clear of a man who owns you," Dinah replied, her eyes distant. "And he planning something. Building that place with all them straps and chains, bringing in all them animals. A doctor don't need animal pens right next to where he treats people. Unless—" She didn't finish the thought, but Clara understood the implication. Dinah's fears would prove tragically prescient. On February 18, 1847, Thornwell summoned Virgil Rayburn to his study and provided him with a list of specific requirements. He needed to identify enslaved individuals who met precise criteria, relatively young, in apparent good health, and notably showing signs of particular illnesses or weaknesses that Thornwell had been documenting. The list was specific in a way that chilled Rayburn, though as a man whose living came from overseeing human property, he had learned to quiet his conscience years ago. The first name on the list was a man named Augustus, 31 years old, who had developed a persistent cough that winter. Thornwell's notes indicated possible lung disease, though Augustus was still working full days and showed no signs of severe illness. The second was a woman named Pearl, 26, who Thornwell had observed struggling with what he diagnosed as a weak heart. She occasionally experienced palpitations and shortness of breath during exertion. "I'll need them moved to the recovery room in the medical building," Thornwell instructed. "Tell them they're being treated for their ailments. Free treatment, superior to anything they'd receive elsewhere. Make it sound like good fortune." Rayburn shifted uncomfortably, and if they don't want to go, Thornwell's expression didn't change. "Mr. Rayburn, I don't believe I need to explain to you how authority works on a plantation. They'll go because I've decided they'll go. The choice isn't theirs to make." The conversation represented a crucial moment, one that would be documented years later in testimony Rayburn provided to investigators. He claimed he didn't know what Thornwell planned. He insisted he believed the doctor genuinely intended to treat sick slaves, perhaps experimenting with new medicines, but nothing worse. Whether this was true or a convenient lie to avoid criminal charges, we'll never know with certainty. What we do know is that Rayburn followed his orders, and on February 20th, 1847, Augustus and Pearl were escorted to the medical building. They never returned to the quarters. The first experiment began on the evening of February 20th, 1847, after Thornwell had spent the day in preparation that was meticulous to the point of ritual. He had reviewed his anatomical texts, sharpened his surgical instruments, and made extensive notes about his theoretical approach. His journal from that day, which would later be entered into evidence during the legislative inquiry, reveals both the precision of his planning and the absolute absence of any moral hesitation. Subject 1 male, approximately 31 years, showing progressive respiratory decline, he wrote in a neat, steady hand. Hypothesis: replacement of diseased lung tissue with healthy animal equivalent may restore respiratory function. Selected donor juvenile pig, age approximately 6 months, demonstrating excellent health and vigor. Proceeding with right lung transplantation, as this represents less risk of immediate cardiac complications. The clinical language concealed an act of unimaginable cruelty. Augustus had been told he would receive treatment for his cough. He had been given what Thornwell described as medicine, but was actually a mild sedative mixed with whiskey. When Augustus became drowsy and compliant, he was moved to the surgical theater and secured to the table. The restraints were explained as necessary to keep him still during treatment. By the time Augustus began to understand what was actually happening, it was too late. What occurred in that surgical theater over the next 3 hours defied every principle of medical ethics that existed, even in that morally compromised era. Thornwell attempted a procedure that wouldn't be successfully performed on humans for another 100 years, and he attempted it without anesthesia. Ether wouldn't be demonstrated publicly until October of that same year, and without any understanding of infection control, blood typing, or tissue rejection. The journal entry that followed the surgery was brief. Subject 1 expired at 11:47 p.m., approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes post-procedure. Immediate cause respiratory failure combined with severe hemorrhaging. Notes for future attempts: need faster surgical technique to minimize blood loss. Animal tissue integration not observed due to rapid decline. Conclusion: failure. But methodology shows promise with refinement. Augustus's body was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the plantation property before dawn. Rayburn supervised the burial, telling the enslaved community that Augustus had died from his lung disease despite the doctor's best efforts. The story was accepted not because anyone believed it, but because the alternative was too terrible to confront, and because enslaved people had learned that survival often required accepting obvious lies without protest. Dinah knew better. She had heard sounds from the medical building that night, not screams exactly, but something worse. Muffled noises that suggested someone struggling against restraints, unable to cry out fully. She had seen Thornwell emerge the next morning, his clothes changed but spots of blood still visible on his boots, and she had noticed that the young pig Thornwell had acquired 2 weeks earlier was gone, its pen empty and cleaned. "They killed Augustus," she told a small group of trusted people that evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever that man doing in that building, it ain't healing. It's something else, something evil. But what could they do?" Speaking to white authorities meant certain punishment or death. Running meant leaving family behind and likely being caught and returned. The trap was perfect and total. They could only watch and wait and pray they wouldn't be chosen next. Thornwell waited 3 days before selecting his second subject. Pearl, the woman with the weak heart, was brought to the medical building on February 23rd. She had been monitored constantly since Augustus's death, with Thornwell checking her pulse multiple times daily and making extensive notes about her symptoms. His journal reveals that he understood his first failure resulted partly from attempting too complex a procedure. For his second attempt, he chose what he considered a simpler approach. The entry reads, "Subject 2 female, approximately 26 years, demonstrating cardiac arrhythmia and reduced stamina. Hypothesis: animal heart tissue, properly integrated, may strengthen weakened cardiac function. Selected approach: partial transplantation of lamb heart tissue to supplement rather than replace existing organ. Donor female lamb, age 8 months, excellent cardiovascular health." The procedure took place on the night of February 23rd. Pearl survived 6 hours post-surgery. The cause of death was listed as acute cardiac failure with extensive hemorrhaging. Her body joined Augustus's in the unmarked graves. The pattern had been established. Every 3 to 4 days, Thornwell selected another subject. His criteria evolved as he learned from each failure. He began choosing younger subjects, theorizing that youth meant stronger recovery potential. He varied his approach, attempting kidney transplants, liver tissue grafts, even a procedure involving sheep lung tissue that he hypothesized might prove more compatible than pig lung. The methodology remained consistent: sedation through deception, restraint, surgery without adequate pain control, meticulous documentation of the inevitable failure, and burial before dawn. The journal recorded each death with the same clinical detachment: Subject 3, Subject 4, Subject 5. Names were rarely used. Thornwell referred to the enslaved people as numbered subjects, as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings. By March, the enslaved community at Belmont was paralyzed by terror. 4 people had been taken to the medical building. None had returned. The official explanations: died from their existing conditions, died from complications during treatment, convinced no one. People began refusing to report illnesses, fearing that any sign of weakness would make them targets. Parents coached children to appear healthy no matter how they felt. Dinah herself became Thornwell's 8th subject on March 12, 1847. He had observed her treating others with herbal remedies and diagnosed her with what he called chronic digestive disorder. She occasionally experienced stomach pains, a common enough condition that she had never considered significant. On the evening of March 12th, Rayburn came to her door and informed her that Dr. Thornwell wished to treat her condition. She knew what this meant. She embraced her daughter Clara, whispered instructions about where she had hidden her herbs and healing knowledge, and walked to the medical building without resistance. Fighting would only mean being dragged, and she preferred to maintain what dignity remained available to her. Dinah survived 11 hours after Thornwell attempted to graft pig stomach tissue into her abdomen. Her last words, recorded by Thornwell in his journal with what reads as frustration rather than remorse, were, "God see you." She died just after dawn on March 13th, the 9th person Thornwell had killed in the name of medical advancement. Her death marked a turning point. Clara, grief-stricken and pregnant, did something extraordinarily dangerous. She approached a white minister, who had occasionally visited the plantation to conduct services, a man named Reverend Thomas Alston, who had a reputation as relatively sympathetic to the enslaved population's spiritual welfare. She told him people were dying at Belmont, not from disease, but from something being done to them in the medical building. Alston's response would later be documented in letters he wrote to colleagues, letters that eventually played a role in the investigation. He listened to Clara's account with what he described as growing horror, but he did not immediately act. Instead, he did what many supposedly moral men did. In that era, he convinced himself that a reasonable explanation must exist. A trained physician experimenting to help sick slaves, surely that couldn't be as sinister as this distraught girl suggested. He told Clara he would look into the matter, but privately he did nothing, afraid of making accusations that might prove embarrassing. This inaction cost lives. Thornwell continued his experiments through March and into April. His technique improved. He worked faster, lost less blood during procedures, refined his surgical approach, but the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. With 1847 medical knowledge, the human body rejected foreign tissue. Every subject died, most within hours, a few lasting as long as 2 days before succumbing to infection, blood loss, or organ failure. By late April 1847, Thornwell had killed 19 people. The plantation's enslaved population had declined from 42 to 23, a loss too significant to hide completely. Questions began circulating in Charleston. Why had Belmont experienced such dramatic mortality? Plantations certainly saw death, disease, injury, childbirth complications, but 19 deaths in 2 months was extraordinary even by the standards of that brutal institution. The questions reached the local medical society, where Thornwell's colleagues began asking what exactly he was researching at his private facility. He deflected with vague references to experimental treatments for pulmonary and cardiac diseases, to the difficulty of treating seriously ill patients, to the unfortunate reality that medicine sometimes failed despite best efforts. His reputation as a trained physician from Edinburgh carried weight, and his generous donations to the Medical Society's library fund encouraged colleagues to accept his explanations without probing too deeply. But not everyone was satisfied. Dr. Edmund Whitlock, a Charleston physician who specialized in treating the enslaved population and who had developed misgivings about Thornwell's character during their brief interactions, began asking pointed questions. What specific treatments was Thornwell attempting? Why were the mortality rates so extreme? Could he visit Belmont and observe the medical facility? Thornwell refused the visit, citing patient confidentiality and proprietary medical research he wasn't ready to share. This refusal troubled Whitlock, but it didn't legally prevent Thornwell from continuing. South Carolina law provided no protection for enslaved people against medical experimentation. They were classified as property, and property owners could do as they wished with their possessions. This legal reality meant that even physicians who suspected something wrong had no mechanism for intervention. Meanwhile, the remaining people at Belmont lived in constant fear. They watched as Thornwell made his rounds, his journal always in hand, observing them with that clinical detachment that had become so familiar and so terrifying. They knew that any sign of illness, any complaint of pain, any visible weakness might result in selection. Some deliberately injured themselves in ways that would make them unsuitable for surgery. broken fingers, gashed arms, reasoning that a damaged subject would be less valuable than an intact one. Others prayed silently, hoping God might intervene where no human would. Clara gave birth to a daughter on May 3, 1847, delivering the baby with assistance from other women in the quarters, terrified that if she sought help from Thornwell, he would use childbirth complications as an excuse for experimentation. She named the baby Dinah, after the grandmother who had died trying to protect others. The birth gave her a renewed determination to survive, but it also deepened her despair. She was bringing a child into a place where death prowled systematically, dressed in the clothes of a physician. Thornwell's journal from early May reveals a troubling evolution in his thinking. After 19 failures, he began to theorize that the problem wasn't his surgical technique, which had indeed improved dramatically, but rather what he called the quality of the subjects. He wrote, "Reflection on recent failures suggests that subjects weakened by poor diet, inadequate housing, and manual labor may lack the constitutional strength to survive transplantation. Future experiments should utilize subjects in peak physical condition with no prior health complaints to eliminate variables related to pre-existing weakness." This represented a horrifying shift. Previously, Thornwell had justified his experiments by claiming to treat sick individuals. Now he was planning to operate on healthy people, removing that already thin rationalization. He began observing the healthiest individuals at Belmont with renewed interest. On May 14, 1847, he selected a young man named Benjamin, 23 years old, who had never reported illness and who worked as a carpenter maintaining plantation buildings. Benjamin was strong, alert, and showed no health problems whatsoever. His only misfortune was possessing the perfect health Thornwell now wanted to test. The surgery took place on May 15th. Thornwell attempted a kidney transplant using tissue from a young ram, hypothesizing that kidney function might prove less complex than cardiac or pulmonary systems. Benjamin survived 4 days, longer than most subjects, before dying from what the journal recorded as acute renal failure and systemic infection. He was the 20th victim. That same week, 3 events occurred that would eventually unravel Thornwell's operation, though none would move quickly enough to prevent many more deaths. First, Dr. A. Whitlock wrote to the Medical Society of South Carolina, formally requesting an investigation into the mortality rate at Belmont. His letter was carefully worded to avoid direct accusations, but it raised questions about whether Thornwell might be attempting overly aggressive experimental treatments without proper medical justification. Second, an enslaved man named Isaac, 35 years old, escaped from Belmont. He had watched 20 people die and decided that running, even with its enormous risks, was preferable to waiting for selection. He made it as far as Georgetown, 40 miles north, before being captured. When interrogated about why he ran, he told his captors that the doctor at Belmont is killing people. This statement was recorded but largely dismissed. Enslaved people making accusations against white property owners were rarely believed, and Isaac's claims sounded fantastical. Third, and most significantly, a medical supply merchant in Charleston became suspicious about Thornwell's orders. The merchant, a man named Robert Finch, had been selling Thornwell surgical instruments, laudanum, sutures, and other supplies for several months. The quantities were unusual, far more than a single physician treating occasional patients should need. Moreover, Thornwell had recently requested several specialized instruments, large-bore needles, vascular clamps, and cutting tools more commonly used in veterinary medicine or butchery than in treating human patients. Finch mentioned his concerns to Dr. Whitlock during a chance encounter at a medical society meeting. Whitlock shared his own suspicions, and the two men decided to approach the society's leadership with their concerns. However, they faced a significant obstacle. Thornwell had donated enough money to have substantial influence with the society's governing board, and several board members were reluctant to investigate a fellow physician based on what they considered circumstantial evidence and speculation. The bureaucratic delays would prove fatal. Through May and June of 1847, Thornwell continued his experiments at an accelerating pace. His journal shows increasing obsession and decreasing caution. He was no longer selecting subjects based primarily on health conditions. By this point, nearly everyone at Belmont was healthy, simply because the sick had already been killed. Instead, he began choosing subjects based on what he called anatomical optimization. He measured people. He recorded their weights, heights, lung capacities, pulse rates. He compared these measurements to the animals he had acquired and selected human subjects whose physical dimensions most closely matched the donor animals, theorizing that size compatibility might improve transplant success. The journal reveals a mind that had completely abandoned any recognition of the subjects as human beings with rights, feelings, or dignity. They had become variables in an equation he was determined to solve. Subject 23 was a teenage boy named Samuel, 16 years old, selected because his chest measurements closely matched those of a young pig Thornwell had purchased specifically for this experiment. The surgery, performed on May 28th, attempted a double lung transplant. Samuel survived 14 hours. His death was recorded with unusual frustration. Subject 23 showed stronger vital signs than previous subjects, suggesting improved technique and subject selection. Premature failure disappointing. Possible cause inadequate vascular connections. Future attempts should focus on more precise arterial grafting. The remaining people at Belmont, now fewer than 20, had passed beyond fear into a kind of numb horror. They worked mechanically, spoke little, and avoided Thornwell's gaze whenever possible. Parents held their children close at night, knowing that youth offered no protection. Elders offered what comfort they could, but traditional sources of solace, faith in eventual freedom, hope for better circumstances, had been ground away by the relentless, systematic killing. Clara, now caring for her infant daughter, found herself chosen on June 8th. Thornwell had noted that she had recovered quickly from childbirth and appeared to be in excellent health. His entry reads, Subject 27 female, approximately 21 years, recently postpartum. Excellent cardiovascular health observed during childbirth recovery. Subject demonstrates superior physical resilience, making her ideal for cardiac transplantation experiment. Hypothesis: youth and recent successful childbirth indicate strong constitutional health that may support integration of animal cardiac tissue. Clara was taken from her nursing infant and brought to the medical building. Unlike earlier subjects, she screamed and fought. She begged to be allowed to feed her baby one more time. Thornwell's response, recorded in his journal, was chilling. Subject 27 demonstrated significant distress and resistance, required additional restraints and double dose of sedative. Such emotional instability may compromise experimental results. Future subject selection should consider temperament as variable. The surgery took place on the evening of June 8th. Thornwell attempted to graft sheep heart tissue onto Clara's existing heart, a procedure he had tried twice before with equally fatal results. Clara survived 18 hours, dying on the morning of June 9th. Her baby, left without a mother or anyone able to nurse her, was given to another woman to feed, but the infant struggled without her mother and died 3 days later. The double death, mother and infant, finally pushed the enslaved community beyond endurance. A group of 4 men, knowing they faced likely death whether they acted or not, decided to try reaching Charleston to tell authorities what was happening. They understood this was probably suicidal. Running from a plantation was a capital offense. Making accusations against a white property owner was essentially suicide. But watching their community be systematically killed had become unbearable. The 4 men, James, Henry, William, and Peter, left Belmont on the night of June 14th. They made it approximately 8 miles before being spotted by a patrol. 3 were captured immediately. Peter, the youngest, managed to escape initial capture and ran for Charleston, arriving exhausted and terrified at the offices of a lawyer named Marcus Whitfield, who had a reputation for occasionally taking cases involving enslaved people. Peter's account, delivered in gasping, terrified fragments, finally provided the testimony that would break the case open. He described watching 28 people taken to the medical building and none returning. He described the sounds from that building at night, not screaming exactly because Thornwell's sedatives prevented that, but groans and the sounds of struggle against restraints. He described seeing Thornwell's bloodied clothes, the burial details, the atmosphere of terror. Whitfield, to his credit, took the accusation seriously. He had heard rumors about unusual mortality at Belmont from multiple sources now. Isaac's earlier claims, Dr. Whitlock's concerns, questions circulating in legal circles. He decided to bring Peter's testimony directly to the Charleston County Sheriff, a man named Daniel Patterson, who had authority to investigate even prominent citizens if criminal activity was suspected. Patterson's initial reaction was skepticism. The accusation seemed fantastic, a respected physician systematically killing enslaved people for medical experiments. It sounded like the plot of a sensational novel, not reality. But Whitfield pressed him, pointing out the multiple independent sources raising concerns about Belmont. Patterson agreed to visit the plantation, though he made clear he was investigating claims of excessive mortality, not accusations of deliberate killing, which he still found difficult to believe. The visit was scheduled for June 20th, 1847. Patterson sent word to Thornwell that he would be conducting a routine inspection of the property's medical facilities, a notification that was legally required. This advance notice would prove nearly disastrous for the investigation. Thornwell received Patterson's notification on June 16th. His response reveals both cunning and desperation. He understood that evidence of his activities existed throughout the medical building: surgical tools with blood residue, the restraint mechanisms, the animal pens with their drainage systems, and most damningly, his journal with its meticulous documentation of 29 murders disguised as medical experiments. He spent June 17th through 19th attempting to sanitize the facility. He cleaned surgical instruments obsessively. He removed the most obvious restraints from the surgical theater, though the bolt points remained visible in walls and floors. He moved several animals to a barn on the far side of the plantation property, and he hid his journal behind a false panel he had constructed in the surgical theater wall, a panel concealed behind a cabinet of medical texts. But he couldn't hide everything. The graves existed, 29 bodies buried in a row at the property's edge. The recovered room still showed signs of its true purpose, with the narrow beds and their attached restraints. The surgical theater, despite cleaning, had blood traces in the wood grain of the floor and table. And most significantly, 16 surviving enslaved people remained as living witnesses to what they had experienced. Thornwell's plan was to present himself as a dedicated physician who had attempted to treat seriously ill people with experimental therapies, all of which unfortunately failed. High mortality rates were tragic but not criminal. He would emphasize his credentials, his intentions to advance medical science, and the legal reality that enslaved people were his property to treat as he saw fit. He believed, with some justification, that the legal system would support a white physician's right to experiment on people he owned. What he didn't anticipate was Sheriff Patterson's thoroughness. Patterson arrived on June 20th, accompanied not just by deputies, but also by Dr. Whitlock, whom he had asked to provide medical expertise in evaluating the facility. Whitlock had been pushing for investigation for weeks and was grimly determined to uncover the truth. The inspection began in the medical building. Patterson examined the surgical theater, noting the bolt points and asking their purpose. Thornwell explained they were for securing delirious patients who might injure themselves. Patterson noted the drainage channels and the proximity to where animals had clearly been kept. Why was there a direct connection between animal housing and a surgical theater anatomical study? Thornwell replied smoothly. Understanding animal physiology helps inform treatment of similar conditions in humans. Dr. Whitlock examined the surgical instruments and found several that troubled him. Large cutting tools, vascular clamps, needles of unusual size. Dr. Thornwell, these instruments seem more suited to veterinary work than treating human patients. Can you explain their purpose? Advanced surgical techniques sometimes require specialized tools, Thornwell responded. I've been attempting procedures that go beyond conventional medicine. What procedures exactly? Patterson asked. Thornwell hesitated, then offered a partial truth. Experimental organ treatments, attempting to address diseases of the heart, lungs, liver, kidneys through direct surgical intervention, and the results unsuccessful thus far. Medicine involves trial and error, Sheriff. Sometimes patients die despite our best efforts. Patterson moved to the recovery room. 8 narrow beds, all with restraint mechanisms. Why does every bed have straps? Doctor, post-surgical patients often experience fever and delirium. The restraints prevent them from tearing at sutures or injuring themselves during recovery. It was a plausible explanation. Everything Thornwell said was carefully constructed to sound reasonable if one didn't look too closely. Patterson and Whitlock exchanged glances, both feeling that something was deeply wrong, but unable to immediately prove criminal activity. Then, Patterson asked to speak with the enslaved people who worked at the plantation. Thornwell tensed visibly, but couldn't refuse without appearing guilty. He attempted to control the situation by suggesting they speak with Rayburn, the overseer, who could provide context for any claims. Patterson agreed to speak with Rayburn, but insisted on also interviewing others privately. The interviews took place in the main house's kitchen, away from Thornwell's direct oversight. Patterson spoke with 5 people, including 3 who had witnessed others being taken to the medical building. Their accounts, delivered with the careful caution of people who knew that saying the wrong thing could mean death, nonetheless painted a consistent and disturbing picture. A woman named Ruth, 38 years old, described what she had seen people go in that building. They don't come out. We hear things at night. Then we bury someone next morning. Been like that since March. Near 30 people dead now. What kind of things do you hear? Patterson asked. Ruth hesitated, glancing toward the door as if Thornwell might be listening. Sounds like someone being hurt but can't scream proper. Muffled sounds, and then quiet. Next day, doctor tells us someone died from their sickness, but she trailed off. But what? But some of them wasn't sick when they went in. Some was healthy as could be. Similar accounts came from the others Patterson interviewed. Healthy people being taken to the medical building. Strange sounds. Bodies buried before dawn. An atmosphere of terror that had settled over Belmont like a fog. Patterson noticed that all of them mentioned Thornwell's journal. He apparently wrote in it constantly, observing people and making notes before selecting them. Where is this journal? Patterson asked Thornwell when they resumed the official inspection. I maintain medical records of all patients and research subjects, Thornwell replied. Those records are confidential and also represent proprietary medical research. I'm not comfortable sharing them without legal compulsion. I'm a county sheriff investigating possible criminal activity, Patterson said, his tone hardening. That constitutes legal compulsion. Produce the journal, Doctor. Thornwell's face went pale. He made a show of checking his study, his living quarters, the medical building, anywhere except the hiding place behind the wall panel. After an hour of searching, he claimed the journal must have been misplaced. Perhaps stolen by one of the enslaved people who resented his authority. The claim was transparent. Whitlock challenged him directly. Dr. Thornwell, I've known you for a year. I've never seen you without that journal. You carry it everywhere. You've misplaced it the very day a sheriff arrives to investigate. That strains credibility. The inspection ended with Patterson declaring that he would be conducting a more thorough investigation, including examination of the burial sites and formal interviews with all survivors. He left deputies at Belmont with instructions to prevent anyone, Thornwell included, from leaving the property or disturbing any potential evidence. That night, in the main house, Thornwell sat alone with a glass of whiskey and contemplated his situation. He had killed 29 people in pursuit of what he still considered legitimate scientific research. He had detailed documentation of every death hidden behind a wall. He had 16 living witnesses to the terror he had created, and he had a sheriff who clearly suspected the truth. His options were limited and grim. He could destroy the journal, But that wouldn't eliminate the physical evidence or the testimony. He could flee, but where he would be fugitive from justice, unable to practice medicine. He could try to brazen it out, relying on the legal system's protection of white property rights and the medical establishment's reluctance to condemn a colleague. Or he could do what part of him had perhaps always known he would do, ensure that the full truth of his work was preserved for future medical understanding. Consequences be damned. Because despite everything, Silas Thornwell still believed he had been engaged in groundbreaking research that future generations would vindicate. He retrieved the journal from its hiding place and sat reading his own entries by lamplight, remembering each subject, each procedure, each failure. Tomorrow he decided he would present Sheriff Patterson with the full documentation. Let them judge him. Let history judge him. He would not destroy the record of his work. This decision would have consequences that neither Thornwell nor Patterson could fully anticipate. Sheriff Patterson returned to Belmont on June 21st with a magistrate, 2 additional deputies, and a representative from the State Medical Board. The latter's presence indicated that this had escalated beyond a local investigation. The medical community needed to understand what had occurred and potentially discipline one of its own. Thornwell met them on the main house porch. He appeared composed, even defiant. Without preamble, he handed Patterson his journal. You want to understand what I've been doing? Read this. Every procedure is documented. Every hypothesis, every result, every conclusion. This represents pioneering medical research that attempted to solve problems that currently kill thousands. Patterson opened the journal and began reading. His expression shifted from skepticism to shock to barely controlled rage as he turned pages. The clinical language couldn't obscure what was being described: systematic human experimentation resulting in deliberate death. Subject 1 through Subject 29, each entry detailing a person's selection, the procedure performed on them, and their inevitable death. These are people, Dr. Thornwell, Patterson said quietly, his voice tight with anger. You're writing about people as if they were laboratory specimens. They were subjects in medical research designed to advance surgical science, Thornwell replied. In Europe, physicians regularly conduct experimental procedures. The only difference here is that I had access to subjects whose loss wouldn't impact society's functioning. These were enslaved laborers, Sheriff. Property. Under South Carolina law, I had every right to use my property in pursuit of scientific advancement. The argument was legally sound in the twisted logic of 1847 slavery law, which classified enslaved people as property rather than persons. Thornwell believed this would protect him. He was about to learn otherwise. The magistrate, a man named Charles Henderson who had 20 years of legal experience, examined the journal carefully. He read several entries in full, his face growing increasingly grim. Finally, he looked up at Thornwell. Doctor, your legal analysis is flawed in several critical respects. First, while South Carolina law does classify enslaved people as property, it also includes provisions against wanton destruction of valuable property. You've destroyed 29 human beings worth considerable money. Second, the manner of death matters. Even property law recognizes that some acts are so excessive, so cruel, that they constitute criminal behavior regardless of the victim's legal status. Third, and most significantly, you documented evidence of medical malpractice so egregious that it threatens the reputation of the entire medical profession. Thornwell's composure cracked slightly. Malpractice. I was attempting advanced surgical procedures that... You were performing surgeries you knew would be fatal, Henderson interrupted. You documented that knowledge. Your own journal shows you understood that transplanting animal organs into humans would result in death, yet you continued anyway. That's not medicine, Doctor. That's systematic killing disguised as research. Doctor. Whitlock, who had been reading over Henderson's shoulder, added his assessment. Dr. Thornwell, I'm formally recommending to the State Medical Board that your license be revoked. You've violated every ethical principle of medical practice. You've brought shame to our profession. And you've provided ammunition to those who criticize scientific medicine as barbaric. The damage you've done extends far beyond your victims. Patterson made the arrest official. Silas Thornwell, you're charged with destruction of property, criminal malpractice, and gross cruelty. You'll be held pending trial. The charges were revealing in their limitations. In 1847, South Carolina, killing enslaved people wasn't automatically murder under the law. The charges had to be framed around property destruction and professional misconduct, not the moral reality that Thornwell had committed serial murder. This legal framework would prove controversial and would contribute to later reforms, though such changes came too late for Thornwell's victims. The investigation expanded rapidly. Patterson ordered excavation of the burial site, confirming 29 bodies buried in shallow graves, all showing signs of surgical intervention. The State Medical Board convened an emergency hearing to examine Thornwell's actions and their implications for medical regulation. Newspaper accounts appeared in Charleston papers, though they treated the story with surprising restraint. The white establishment was uncomfortable with the implications of publicizing a case that highlighted the horrific possibilities enabled by slavery law. Meanwhile, the surviving people at Belmont, 16 souls who had endured months of terror, faced an uncertain future. Thornwell's arrest meant the plantation would be liquidated to cover legal costs and compensate whoever the court determined had standing. In practical terms, the survivors would likely be sold to new owners, scattered across the state. The trauma they had experienced would go unacknowledged, untreated, and largely undocumented beyond brief statements in court records. One significant question remained: what would happen to Thornwell's journal? It represented unprecedented documentation of medical crimes, but it also contained detailed surgical notes that some physicians argued had scientific value. Several members of the medical board wanted the journal preserved as evidence of what not to do, a cautionary tale for future medical students. Others wanted it destroyed entirely, fearing it would inspire similar experiments or provide a how-to guide for monstrous behavior. The trial began on August 12, 1847, in Charleston County Court. Thornwell was defended by a lawyer named Simon Fletcher, who pursued a defense strategy that was both clever and morally repulsive. He argued that while Thornwell's experiments had been unsuccessful and perhaps excessive, they didn't constitute crimes under existing law. Enslaved people were property, medical experimentation was a recognized practice, and tragic outcomes didn't equal criminal intent. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Simmons, had to navigate the restrictive legal framework of slavery law while still securing conviction. He focused on property destruction, proving that Thornwell had intentionally wasted valuable property through experiments he knew would fail. He emphasized the systematic nature of the killings and Thornwell's own documentation, showing he understood the procedures were fatal. The key moment came when several survivors testified. Ruth, the woman who had spoken to Sheriff Patterson during the initial investigation, described watching her community be methodically destroyed. She spoke about Thornwell's journal, how he would observe people and write notes before selecting his next subject, like a hunter choosing prey. He'd watch us work, she testified, write things in that book. Then, couple days later, he'd send Mr. Rayburn to fetch whoever he'd been watching. That person go to the medical building, we'd hear sounds at night. By morning, they'd be dead. Happened 29 times. We couldn't stop it. Couldn't run, couldn't hide, just wait and pray he didn't pick us next. Her testimony, delivered in the careful, measured tone of someone who understood that displaying too much emotion could be used against her, was nonetheless devastating. The jury, composed entirely of white property owners who generally supported slavery, appeared visibly uncomfortable. Even within the moral framework of 1847 South Carolina, there were limits to acceptable behavior, and Thornwell had exceeded them. The defense tried to discredit the survivors' testimony by suggesting they were unreliable witnesses who resented their owner and were fabricating claims. This strategy backfired when the prosecution introduced Thornwell's journal, which corroborated every detail the survivors had described. The journal was Thornwell's undoing. His compulsion to document his work provided irrefutable evidence of systematic killing. The trial lasted 6 days. On August 18, 1847, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge, a man named William Rutledge, delivered a sentence that reflected both outrage at Thornwell's actions and the legal limitations of the era. "Dr. Thornwell," Rutledge said, "you have committed acts that shock the conscience of this community. You have perverted medical science into an instrument of systematic killing. You have violated the trust placed in physicians and brought disgrace upon your profession. While the law limits the charges I can apply, given the legal status of your victims, I can still impose the maximum penalties available. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary, a fine of $5,000, and permanent revocation of your medical license. 15 years for 29 murders." The sentence reflected the brutal reality that enslaved people's lives had minimal legal value. Thornwell would serve only 11 years before being released due to declining health in 1858. He died in 1862, living long enough to see the Civil War begin, but not its conclusion or the end of slavery that would have fundamentally invalidated his legal defense. The Belmont plantation was sold at auction in September 1847. The 16 survivors were sold to different owners across South Carolina, as was standard practice when plantations were liquidated. There is no evidence that anyone considered keeping them together or acknowledging their trauma. They simply became part of other labor forces, expected to continue working as if the previous 6 months hadn't occurred. Thornwell's journal became the subject of intense debate. The state medical board ultimately decided to preserve it under seal, arguing it represented important evidence of medical ethics violations that future doctors should study. The journal was placed in the Medical Society of South Carolina's archives, with restrictions that it could only be viewed by licensed physicians for educational purposes. This decision had an unintended consequence. In 1852, a medical student named Walter Harris violated the access restrictions and made copies of several journal entries. Harris, who opposed slavery on moral grounds, provided these copies to abolitionist newspapers in the North. The excerpts were published with outraged commentary about the horrors that slavery enabled. Southern medical societies reacted furiously to this publication, viewing it as Northern propaganda designed to attack the South's institutions. The Medical Society of South Carolina responded by ordering Thornwell's journal destroyed to prevent further excerpts from being published. On March 7, 1852, the journal was officially burned in the presence of the Society's board of directors. Or so everyone believed. What actually happened was that Dr. Edmund Whitlock, who had been instrumental in investigating Thornwell and who recognized the historical importance of preserving evidence of this atrocity, secretly replaced the journal with a dummy volume before the burning. He hid the real journal in his home, intending eventually to donate it to a historical archive once enough time had passed for passions to cool. Whitlock died in 1869, and his heirs, not knowing the journal's significance, placed his papers and possessions in storage in what had been his surgical practice. When the building was converted into apartments in 1875, Whitlock's storage was moved to a false-walled compartment in what had been his surgical theater. The journal remained hidden there, forgotten, for 16 years. The Great Charleston Fire of 1891 destroyed the building, but not its brick structural walls. When the ruins were being cleared for rebuilding, workers discovered the hidden compartment and Whitlock's stored papers, including Thornwell's journal. The discovery made newspapers, reopening old wounds and old debates. By 1891, the world had changed dramatically. Slavery had been abolished. Medical ethics had evolved, with the Hippocratic Oath being taken more seriously and the first medical ethics codes being established. Thornwell's experiments were viewed not through the lens of property law, but as straightforward murder disguised as science. A legislative inquiry was convened to examine what had occurred at Belmont and how such atrocities had been legally permitted. The inquiry's report, published in 1893, included extensive quotes from Thornwell's journal and testimony from two survivors who were located and interviewed, Ruth and a man named Thomas, now both in their 70s, living in different states. Their testimony provided additional details about the terror at Belmont. Ruth described the atmosphere of fear, the way people stopped reporting illness because it made them targets, the way families clung together knowing separation was coming. Thomas described watching Thornwell write in his journal the clinical way he would observe people's breathing or pulse, the selection process that felt like being chosen for death. The inquiry's conclusions were damning not just of Thornwell, but of the system that had enabled him. The report stated, "The tragedy at Belmont represents not merely one man's moral failure, but a systemic failure of law, ethics, and human decency." Dr. Thornwell's crimes were facilitated by legal structures that classified human beings as property, by professional societies that prioritized reputation over accountability, and by a society that valued scientific advancement without considering the human cost. We cannot undo the harm that was done, but we can acknowledge that these 29 people were victims of both an individual monster and monstrous institutions. The 16 survivors of Belmont scattered after the plantation's liquidation. Research in the years following the 1891 rediscovery identified fates for some of them. Ruth lived until 1899, dying in Greenville, South Carolina, at age 90. Thomas survived until 1902, living in Georgia with family. Others disappeared from historical records, their ultimate fates unknown, as was common for formerly enslaved people whose lives were rarely documented. The baby who lost both mother and grandmother, little Dinah, survived her precarious first months and was raised by another woman from Belmont named Frances. She lived to adulthood, married, had children of her own, and died in 1912. Her descendants, interviewed during research for the 1893 inquiry follow-up, reported that she never spoke about her early childhood. Whatever she might have remembered of those months, she kept silent. Thornwell's surgical theater, the building where 29 people were killed, was burned by order of the state legislature in 1852, the same year the journal was supposedly destroyed. The foundation was excavated and the bricks were scattered. Nothing remains of the structure today except a historical marker placed in 1994 at what is now a county park, noting that a plantation once stood on this site and that tragic events occurred here. The marker doesn't provide details. There was controversy about how explicitly to acknowledge what happened. The final wording reads, Belmont Plantation, 1846-1847. Site of medical experiments that resulted in the deaths of 29 enslaved people. These individuals died as victims of both individual cruelty and systemic injustice. Their names, largely unrecorded in historical documents, deserve remembrance. Augustus, Pearl, Dinah, Samuel, Clara, Benjamin, and 23 others whose identities were lost to history. May their suffering not be forgotten. The names were drawn from testimony and records that survived. 23 others remain unnamed, their identities lost because Thornwell's journal referred to them only as numbered subjects, and no other records preserved their names. They died anonymously and remain anonymous even in memorialization, a final indignity added to the horrors they endured. Thornwell's journal, the rediscovered original, is now housed in the South Carolina Historical Society's archives. Researchers can access it under strict protocols, and it has been extensively quoted in academic works about medical ethics, slavery, and the history of human experimentation. Reading the journal remains a disturbing experience. The clinical language and careful documentation of suffering create a portrait of a mind that had completely divorced itself from moral consideration. Several medical historians have noted that Thornwell's experiments, horrific as they were, ironically contributed nothing to medical advancement. Every procedure he attempted was doomed to failure because transplant medicine requires understanding of immunology, blood typing, and tissue rejection, knowledge that wouldn't be developed for another 100 years. His victims died for nothing, not even for knowledge that might help others. The story of Belmont raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond Thornwell's individual crimes. How many similar cases occurred that were never discovered? How much suffering was enabled by legal structures that denied humanity to enslaved people? What responsibility do medical professionals have to refuse participation in unjust systems, even when such systems are legally sanctioned? These questions don't have easy answers, but they matter. The 29 people who died at Belmont deserve to be treated as human beings with inherent dignity and worth. Instead, they were treated as experimental subjects in a grotesque pursuit of medical advancement. Their deaths serve as a reminder of what can happen when scientific ambition divorces itself from moral consideration, and when legal systems fail to recognize the humanity of all people. The survivors of Belmont carried their trauma silently, having no real avenue to process or discuss what they had experienced. They lived with nightmares, with grief for lost family members and friends, with the memory of months spent waiting to be selected for death. The psychological toll was never acknowledged by the systems that had failed to protect them, never treated, never even recognized as legitimate suffering. This aspect of the tragedy, the invisible wounds that survivors carried, may be as significant as the visible deaths. We have no record of how Ruth coped with losing nearly 24 people from her community, including watching some of them walk to the medical building knowing they wouldn't return. We don't know how Thomas processed the trauma of months spent in fear. We don't know how baby Dinah was affected by losing her mother and grandmother in her first weeks of life. What we know is that they survived, that they continued, that they found ways to live in a world that had tried to reduce them to property and experimental subjects. Their survival itself is testimony to human resilience, though that resilience should never have been tested so horrifically. The final disposition of Thornwell's remains is unknown. He was buried in an unmarked grave after his death in 1862, his family apparently unwilling to acknowledge him publicly. There is no memorial to his existence except as a cautionary tale, an example of how medical ambition without ethical constraint produces only horror. The real memorials belong to his victims. Augustus, who was told he would be treated for a cough and instead became the first person murdered in Thornwell's surgical theater. Pearl, who worried about her heart and found herself on an operating table. Dinah, the healer who understood what was coming and walked to her death with dignity intact. Samuel, Clara, Benjamin, and 23 others whose names time has erased but whose suffering remains part of the historical record. Their story deserves remembrance not because it is uplifting or redemptive, there is no redemption here, but because it is true, because it happened, because 47 surgical procedures and 29 deaths occurred, because one man decided that medical advancement justified any atrocity, and because a society built on slavery provided the legal and social framework that made such horrors posing. Sibla, what do you think of this story? Do you believe the historical record accurately captured what happened at Belmont? Or might there be even darker truths that remained hidden? This case raises questions about medical ethics that remain relevant today. How do we balance scientific advancement with human rights? What safeguards prevent similar abuses in modern medical research? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this dark chapter of American history compelling, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to never miss stories like this. Share this video with someone who appreciates untold historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters in history weren't supernatural. They were human beings who convinced themselves that their goals justified any means.